It is the winter of 1941. German tanks are stationed several dozen kilometers from the Kremlin. Hitler is confident of imminent victory, but the Führer is unaware of one of Stalin's secrets: the existence of elite divisions hardened in battle with the Japanese in the Siberian snow. These troops will become the force that turns the tide of the greatest battle in human history. Today, we will tell you how the fatal underestimation of the Siberian divisions turned into a disaster for the Third Reich and saved Moscow from capture. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes about little-known facts of history. And in the comments, discuss whether you think Moscow could have fallen without the transfer of the Siberian divisions. Or did the Red Army have other reserves to defend the capital? In the summer days of 1941, Adolf Hitler was absolutely confident of victory. The Führer of the Third Reich looked at the map of the Soviet Union with the same arrogance with which Roman legionaries once looked at the barbarian tribes beyond the borders of the empire. In his eyes, the Red Army was a disorganized mass of poorly trained peasants led by incompetent Bolshevik commanders. This fatal miscalculation was one of the main reasons for the collapse of the Blitzkrieg in the East. At the start of Operation Barbarossa, the German war machine did indeed look invincible. In 2 years of war, the Wehrmacht had crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. European armies collapsed one after another, unable to withstand the onslaught of German tank wedges and dive bombers. The successes went to the heads of not only Hitler, but also his generals, who began to consider themselves unrivaled strategists. The fighting qualities of Soviet soldiers were viewed with particular contempt in Berlin. Nazi racist ideology portrayed Slavs as an inferior race incapable of organized resistance. Secret reports from the Abwehr claimed that Russian troops were demoralized by Stalin's repressions and that their officer corps had been decapitated by the purges of 1937 to 1938. German analysts believed that all it would take was a kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would collapse. Hitler personally shared these views and even reinforced them with his fantasies about the racial superiority of the Aryans. He told his generals that the war against the USSR would not be a conventional military campaign, but a war of annihilation between two irreconcilable ideologies and races. In his opinion, the Slavic subhumans simply could not compare with the German superhumans in military skill and bravery. This ideological blindness led to serious miscalculations in the planning of the operation. The German General Staff assumed that the Red Army had about 200 divisions, most of which could be destroyed in the first weeks of the offensive during massive encirclement operations. No one in Berlin imagined that the Soviet Union was capable of mobilizing and deploying hundreds of new divisions against the Wehrmacht. An even more serious mistake was the underestimation of the quality of the Soviet troops, especially those units stationed far from the western borders. German intelligence knew virtually nothing about the divisions guarding the far eastern borders of the USSR. These troops, hardened in battles with the Japanese at Lake Khasan and on the Khalkhin-Gol River, had invaluable combat experience and were highly trained. Hitler's fatal arrogance was also evident in his disregard for the Russian winter. The Führer was convinced that the campaign would be over before the cold weather set in, so German troops were not issued winter clothing and appropriate equipment. This mistake would cost the Wehrmacht dearly when the frost hit the German soldiers, who were ill-prepared for winter warfare. While war raged in Europe, thousands of soldiers in star-emblazoned caps stood frozen in tense anticipation on the far eastern borders of the Soviet Union. The Siberian and Far Eastern divisions of the Red Army stood guard on the border with Japan, ready at any moment to repel aggression from the land of the rising sun. These troops, whose existence was only vaguely known in Berlin, would become one of Stalin's main trump cards in the battle for Moscow. The history of confrontation with Japan began long before the Great Patriotic War. Back in 1938, a major military clash between Soviet and Japanese troops took place near Lake Khasan. The fighting lasted several weeks and demonstrated the high combat skills of the Far Eastern units of the Red Army. The operation was commanded by Marshal Vasily Blucher, who managed to inflict a significant defeat on the Japanese. Even more serious fighting broke out in the summer of 1939 on the Khalkhin-Gol River in Mongolia. The conflict began over disputed territories between Mongolia and the puppet state of Manchukuo, created by the Japanese in occupied Manchuria. Soviet troops under the command of General Georgy Zhukov dealt a crushing defeat to the Japanese Kwantung Army, demonstrating excellent tactical training and skillful use of armored vehicles. These conflicts forced Moscow to maintain significant military forces on its Far Eastern borders. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, more than 30 divisions with a total strength of about 700,000 men were stationed in Transbaikalia, Primorie, and Sakhalin. This was an elite army, manned by the best officers and sergeants who had been schooled in border conflicts with the Japanese. A distinctive feature of the Far Eastern troops was their unique combat experience. Unlike the divisions of the Western military districts, which for many years had been engaged only in exercises and parades, the Siberian units regularly participated in real combat operations. The officers of these troops knew the value of human life and knew how to fight not on paper, but on the battlefield. The soldiers were battle-hardened, disciplined, and physically resilient. The climatic conditions of Siberia and the Far East also contributed to the formation of a special type of warrior. Long, frosty winters, when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees, taught the fighters to survive in extreme conditions. They knew how to build dugouts and shelters, build fires in the snow, and keep their weapons functioning in the cold. These skills would prove invaluable in the battle for Moscow. The command of the Far Eastern troops was also highly professional. Many generals and colonels had gone through the harsh school of the Civil War, then received modern military education, and were tempered in battles with the Japanese. Among them were such outstanding military leaders as Joseph Apanasenko, Maxim Purkayev, and Ivan Konev, who would later play an important role in the defeat of the German troops. The secrecy surrounding the Far Eastern divisions was no accident. Stalin understood perfectly well the strategic importance of these troops and did everything possible to conceal their true numbers and combat readiness from both the Japanese and the Germans. Even within the Red Army, few knew the true capabilities of the Siberian divisions. When German troops crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, German intelligence was confident in the accuracy of its information about the enemy. The Abwehr, under the leadership of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, provided the command with detailed reports on the deployment of Soviet troops, their numbers, and combat readiness. However, these reports proved to be fatally inaccurate, especially with regard to the reserves of the Red Army and the troops in the eastern military districts. The German assessments were based on information from agents operating in the western regions of the USSR. German residents and their informants were able to estimate relatively accurately the number of divisions stationed in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. But the further east they went, the less reliable the information became. The vast expanses of Siberia and the Far East remained a veritable terra incognita for the Abwehr. The specifics of the Soviet military system created additional complications. Unlike European armies, where troop deployments were relatively stable, the USSR constantly underwent large-scale regroupings and redeployments. Divisions could move thousands of kilometers in a week, which made intelligence data quickly obsolete. In addition, the Soviet command skillfully used disinformation, creating false units and hiding real ones. German miscalculations in assessing the mobilization capabilities of the USSR proved particularly disastrous. When planning Operation Barbarossa, the German General Staff assumed that the Soviet Union would be able to field no more than 250 divisions. This figure seemed quite reasonable, given the losses of the officer corps as a result of Stalin's repressions and the technical backwardness of the Red Army. Reality exceeded even the most daring German expectations. By the end of 1941, the USSR had mobilized over 600 divisions. An equally serious mistake was the underestimation of the quality of Soviet weapons. German intelligence had information about the mass-produced T-26 and T-28 tanks, which were indeed inferior to German panzers. But Berlin knew virtually nothing about the existence of the latest T-34 and KV tanks. The appearance of these vehicles on the battlefield came as an unpleasant surprise to the Wehrmacht tank crews, whose guns were often unable to penetrate Soviet armor. The Abwehr also underestimated the role of geography in the upcoming campaign. German analysts believed that the vast distances in Russia would be more of an obstacle for the defenders than for the attackers. They believed that the Soviet command would be unable to effectively coordinate the actions of troops on a front stretching for thousands of kilometers. In reality, however, a deep defense allowed the USSR to gain time to mobilize reserves and transfer troops from other directions. A critical mistake by German intelligence was its failure to understand the Soviet transport system. The Germans knew about the Trans-Siberian Railway, but seriously underestimated its capacity and strategic importance. They did not imagine that dozens of divisions could be quickly transferred from the Far East to the West via this railway. This underestimation would cost the Wehrmacht dearly in the winter of 1941. Psychological bias also played a role in the failure of German intelligence. Racist beliefs prevented them from objectively assessing the enemy's potential. What makes a warrior invincible? This question has tormented military theorists for centuries, but the answer lay in the Siberian taiga, where a special type of fighter was formed: hardened, resilient, ready to fight to the last bullet. The Siberian divisions were not considered the elite of the Red Army for nothing. Their combat skills were the result of a unique combination of harsh natural conditions, a special mentality, and a well-thought-out training system. Siberia has long been famous for its warriors. Even during the Russian Empire, Siberian rifle regiments were considered among the best in the Russian army. They distinguished themselves in the Russo-Japanese War and fought heroically in World War I. The Revolution and the Civil War did not break this tradition. Siberian Red Army soldiers proved themselves to be steadfast and courageous fighters in all the conflicts of the 1920s and 1930s. The secret of the Siberian character lay in the special conditions of life beyond the Urals. The harsh climate, vast distances, and the need to survive in extreme situations shaped people of a special disposition: independent, decisive, and unaccustomed to retreating in the face of difficulties. Siberian peasants and workers knew the value of life from childhood and knew how to fight for it. These qualities were passed on to the military. The physical training of Siberian soldiers was an order of magnitude higher than that of the average army soldier. Long marches through the taiga, hunting and fishing in extreme conditions developed endurance and strength. Siberians could walk for hours in deep snow without feeling tired, sleep in the cold, and make do with meager food. Their bodies were adapted to the harsh climate, which gave them a huge advantage in winter battles. Special attention was paid to rifle training in Siberian divisions. Many soldiers had been skilled with weapons since childhood and were experienced hunters. In the taiga, where a missed shot could cost a life, they developed exceptional marksmanship. Siberian snipers were renowned throughout the Red Army for their skill. They could hit a target from a great distance and acted stealthily and patiently. The command structure of the Siberian troops was also highly professional. Many officers had been through the harsh school of border conflicts with the Japanese. The battles at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol became a real university of war for them. They learned to make quick decisions in critical situations, use resources sparingly, and make the most of the terrain and weather conditions. The morale of the Siberian divisions was sustained by the special atmosphere that prevailed in these units. The soldiers were proud of their membership in the elite troops and felt responsible for defending the far eastern borders of their homeland. The officers enjoyed unquestionable authority among their subordinates, which ensured high discipline and combat coordination among the units. The technical equipment of the Far Eastern troops was also of a high standard. Given the complex international situation in the region, these divisions were given priority in receiving the latest weapons. They were fully equipped with automatic weapons and had a sufficient number of mortars, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft guns. Tank units were equipped with modern vehicles, including the latest T-34s. There are few figures in the history of intelligence as mysterious and influential as Richard Sorge. This German communist, working undercover as a journalist in Tokyo, managed to create an intelligence network whose information changed the course of World War II. It was Sorge who passed on information to Moscow that Japan had no plans to attack the USSR, which allowed Stalin to make the fateful decision to transfer Siberian divisions to the Western Front. Richard Sorge was born in 1895 into the family of a German engineer working in Russia. His participation in World War I, where he was wounded twice, radically changed his worldview. The young man became imbued with communist ideas and in the early 1920s became an agent of Soviet intelligence. His German origins and impeccable reputation allowed him to infiltrate the most secret circles of Nazi Germany. In 1933, Sorge was assigned to go to Japan under the guise of a correspondent for German newspapers. His mission was to gather information about Japanese military plans and intentions. During his 8 years in Tokyo, he managed to build up an extensive network of agents, including high-ranking Japanese officials, military personnel, and diplomats. A key figure in Sorge's group was Ozaki Hozumi, a Japanese journalist and secret communist who had access to confidential information in government circles. Through him, the Soviet intelligence officer received information about the decisions of the Japanese cabinet, the plans of the military command, and the mood in the imperial palace. This information was regularly transmitted to Moscow by radio. In the summer of 1941, when German troops were already advancing across Soviet territory towards Moscow, feverish discussions were taking place in the headquarters of the Kwantung Army about Japan's next moves. Some generals called for taking advantage of the weakening of the USSR and striking the Far East, while others insisted on advancing into Southeast Asia. Sorge closely monitored these sentiments through his agents. He received decisive information in September 1941. From reliable sources, he learned that the Japanese government had finally decided on its strategy. The land of the rising sun would direct its expansion southward, against American, British, and Dutch possessions in the Pacific. The attack on the USSR was postponed indefinitely. This information was immediately forwarded to Moscow. It was of enormous importance to Stalin. Having received confirmation that the threat from the east had been temporarily removed, the Soviet leader could afford to weaken the Far Eastern group and transfer part of his troops to defend the capital. The decision was made quickly and kept in the strictest secrecy. Sorge's activities were not limited to gathering information about Japanese plans. He also passed on valuable information to Moscow about German intentions, preparations for Operation Barbarossa, and the mood at the German embassy in Tokyo. Unfortunately, Sorge's warnings about Germany's impending attack on the USSR were not taken seriously in the Kremlin. Sorge's fate was tragic. In October 1941, Japanese counterintelligence arrested him and members of his group. After lengthy interrogations and torture, Richard Sorge was sentenced to death and executed in November 1944. The autumn of 1941 was a critical moment in the history of the Soviet Union. German troops stood at the gates of Moscow. Millions of Red Army soldiers were captured or killed, and industrial centers were evacuated to the east. In those tragic days, Joseph Stalin had to make one of the most risky decisions of his life: to weaken the defense of the Far Eastern borders in order to save the capital. This decision required not only strategic thinking from the Soviet leader, but also a willingness to take a huge risk. Information from Richard Sorge that Japan had no plans to attack the USSR reached the Kremlin at a critical moment. Operation Typhoon, the German offensive on Moscow, was advancing at a threatening pace. German tanks broke through the Mojaisk defense line, and Wehrmacht units captured Kaluga and Oryol. Panic gripped the capital, and the evacuation of government agencies and industrial enterprises began. Stalin understood that without serious reinforcements, it would be impossible to hold Moscow. The reserves concentrated in the central regions of the country had already been thrown into battle and suffered huge losses. New divisions being formed in the rear were not yet ready for combat. The only source of experienced and combat-ready troops remained the Far Eastern divisions, but their transfer would mean exposing the border with Japan. The risk was enormous. If the intelligence proved inaccurate and the Japanese decided to attack the weakened Far Eastern borders, the USSR would find itself in a catastrophic situation, fighting on two fronts at once. Even a powerful state like the Soviet Union could not withstand such a war. However, Stalin decided to take this desperate step, trusting the reports of his best agent. The decision to transfer troops from east to west was made in strict secrecy. Even members of the Politburo and the highest military leadership received only the information necessary to carry out their specific tasks. Stalin feared that leaks could provoke the Japanese to change their plans. Initially, the plan was to transfer a relatively small number of divisions, about 10 to 15 units. However, as events unfolded near Moscow, the scale of the transfer grew. By the end of October and beginning of November 1941, more than 30 divisions, including several tank brigades and air regiments, had moved westward from the Far East. Stalin entrusted the coordination of the troop transfer operation to his most trusted men. General Alexei Antonov, one of the Red Army's best staff officers, developed a detailed plan for transporting troops along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Each division was given a strictly defined schedule of movement, unloading routes, and areas of concentration. The entire operation was classified as top secret. Special attention was paid to concealing the transfer from German intelligence. Military trains moved mainly at night, with long stops at large stations in specially equipped shelters. Radio communication was kept to a minimum, with all reports transmitted via wired channels or by courier. Stalin personally supervised the operation, receiving daily reports on the movement of the trains. He understood perfectly well that he was risking not only the fate of Moscow, but also the future of the entire Soviet Union. However, there was no other option. Without fresh forces, it would be impossible to hold the capital. Military trains stretched across the endless expanses of Siberia, through the taiga and steppes, past snow-covered towns and villages. Thousands of cars filled with soldiers, officers, equipment, and ammunition raced along the Trans-Siberian Railway toward the war. This grandiose operation to transfer troops became one of the largest in military history, but at the time, almost no one knew about it. Even many railway workers had no idea of the scale of what was happening. The Trans-Siberian Railway, built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, became a strategic artery connecting the European and Asian parts of Russia. The length of this road was over 9,000 kilometers, stretching from Moscow to Vladivostok. In peacetime, passenger trains and freight trains ran along it. But in the fall of 1941, the railway turned into a giant military conveyor belt. Preparations for the mass transfer of troops began in September 1941. The railway authorities received secret instructions to clear the tracks for military trains. Civilian transport was reduced to a minimum, and passenger trains were cancelled or diverted to spare tracks. The entire capacity of the Trans-Siberian Railway was given over to military needs. The first trains carrying Siberian divisions left the Far Eastern garrisons in mid-October 1941. The soldiers did not know where they were being taken. The officers had been ordered to keep their destination a strict secret. Many soldiers believed that they were being transferred to other areas of the Far East to reinforce the border with Japan. Only as they advanced westward did it become clear that something more serious was going on. The conditions of transport were extremely harsh. 40 to 50 soldiers in full gear were crammed into each freight car. They slept on the floor, on straw or bare boards. The heating was poor and often non-existent. Food consisted of dry rations and hot tea at stations. Many soldiers fell ill on the way, but medical care was limited. Special difficulties arose with the transport of equipment and ammunition. Tanks and artillery pieces were loaded onto special platforms, but there were not enough of them. It was necessary to dismantle vehicles, transport them in parts and components, and then reassemble them at their destinations. Ammunition and fuel required special security measures. Each car was guarded by special guards. The movement of trains was strictly regulated. Each train received a precise schedule that could not be violated for a single minute. The delay of one train could disrupt the entire transport system and lead to a traffic jam on the main line. Station managers were personally responsible for ensuring that military trains ran on schedule. The secrecy of the operation was maintained by the strictest measures. Special cordons were set up at stations where military trains stopped. Soldiers were forbidden to leave the cars, talk to local residents, or send letters home. Disclosure of information about troop movements was punishable by a court-martial with the most severe consequences. The journey from the Far Eastern garrisons to the stations near Moscow took from a week to 10 days, depending on where the train departed from. During this time, the soldiers traveled across the entire country, saw the destruction caused by the war, met with evacuees, and heard stories about the atrocities committed by the invaders. On a frosty morning in late November 1941, German sentries in the trenches near Moscow noticed unusual activity in the Soviet troop positions. New faces appeared in the opposite trenches, soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms with different equipment, speaking the same Russian language but with a distinctive Siberian accent. This was the first time the Wehrmacht had encountered troops about which it knew virtually nothing: the Far Eastern divisions of the Red Army. The first units of Siberian troops began to arrive in the Moscow area in mid-November 1941. They were unloaded at stations deep in the rear, far from the front line, so as not to attract the attention of German intelligence. From there, the troops marched or drove to the front, taking up positions in the most vulnerable areas of the defense. The Western Front Command initially viewed the reinforcements with some skepticism. Many generals believed that the Siberian divisions, accustomed to serving in the peaceful conditions of the Far Eastern garrisons, would be unable to withstand the battle-hardened units of the Wehrmacht. These doubts were quickly dispelled after the first clashes with the enemy. A distinctive feature of the Siberian troops was their exceptional discipline and organization. Unlike the hastily formed Moscow divisions of the People's Militia, these units were a well-coordinated military machine. The soldiers carried out orders flawlessly, knew how to work together in battle, and did not panic even in the most critical situations. The first serious clash took place near Krasnaya Poliana, where units of General Ivan Maslenikov's 39th Army attempted to halt the advance of the German 2nd Panzer Army. The Siberian Rifle Division, which was defending the area, met the attacking Germans with organized fire from all types of weapons. Despite the enemy's numerical superiority, the Siberians not only held their positions but also launched a counterattack, pushing the Germans back to their starting lines. The German soldiers were surprised to discover that they were dealing with a new type of enemy. The Siberians did not abandon their positions at the first shots, as was often the case with demoralized Red Army units in the first months of the war. They fought stubbornly and skillfully, using every fold of the terrain and every cover. Their snipers inflicted heavy losses on German officers and machine gunners. The Germans were particularly impressed by the Siberian troops' adaptation to winter conditions. While German soldiers, who had no winter clothing, suffered from the cold and were unable to operate effectively at low temperatures, the Siberians felt at home in the snow. They knew how to build snow shelters, camouflage themselves in winter forests, and make long marches through deep snow. The technical superiority of the Siberian divisions also quickly became apparent. Their weapons were designed for use in harsh climatic conditions, unlike German equipment, which often failed in the cold. Soviet T-34 and KV tanks, which were supplied to the Far Eastern troops as a matter of priority, proved their superiority over German tanks. The moral impact of the arrival of the Siberian divisions on the overall situation near Moscow cannot be overestimated. Exhausted by months of fighting, the defenders of the capital were heartened by the sight of fresh reinforcements. Rumors of the arrival of the Siberian bogatirs quickly spread across the front, instilling hope in the hearts of soldiers and commanders alike. The Russian winter had long been an ally of the defenders of the fatherland. It had stopped Napoleon in 1812, and now it was preparing to play a fateful role in the fate of Hitler's Wehrmacht. But while winter traditionally meant the end of active combat for European armies, for the Siberian divisions, it became a natural environment in which they gained a decisive advantage over the enemy. Adaptability to harsh winter conditions was the main trump card of the Siberian troops. Most of the soldiers in these divisions were born and raised in a climate where temperatures of -30 to 40 degrees were considered normal. From childhood, they knew how to keep warm, how to handle equipment in the cold, and how to survive in the snow without shelter. These skills were passed down from generation to generation and became part of the national character of Siberians. The winter uniforms of the Siberian divisions were strikingly different from the equipment of other units of the Red Army, not to mention the German troops. The soldiers had warm sheepskin coats, felt boots, fur hats, and special mittens that allowed them to shoot without exposing their hands. Their tents were equipped with small stoves for heating, and their sleeping bags were designed for extreme temperatures. Special attention was paid in the Siberian troops to the care of weapons in winter conditions. Soldiers knew what lubricants to use at low temperatures, how to prevent mechanisms from freezing, and how to quickly bring weapons into combat readiness after prolonged exposure to the cold. Their automatic weapons fired when German rifles and machine guns failed due to the cold. The tactics of winter warfare were also perfected by the Siberian troops. They knew how to use snow cover for camouflage, built snow fortifications that were as strong as earthen ones, and carried out swift ski attacks in deep snow. White camouflage coats made Siberian soldiers virtually invisible against the winter landscape. The psychological impact of the cold on German soldiers was enormous. Accustomed to the mild European climate, they suffered from frostbite, colds, and general exhaustion. The combat effectiveness of German units declined sharply at temperatures below -20 degrees. Many German soldiers feared the cold more than Soviet bullets. The supply of winter clothing to German troops was extremely poorly organized. Hitler, confident of a quick victory, did not anticipate the possibility of a winter campaign. As a result, German soldiers faced the Russian frost in summer uniforms, wrapped in newspapers and rags. Many units lost more men to frostbite than to enemy fire. The technical superiority of the Siberian troops in winter conditions was overwhelming. Soviet tanks and vehicles were adapted to operate at low temperatures and had special heating systems and winter fuel and oil. German equipment broke down en masse, unable to withstand the severe frosts. The Wehrmacht's tank divisions were reduced to infantry, losing their main striking force. The artillery of the Siberian divisions also demonstrated its superiority in winter. Soviet guns and mortars continued to fire in any frost, while German artillery often failed due to the freezing of the recoil and aiming mechanisms. This gave the Siberians a decisive advantage in firefights. The medical service of the Far Eastern troops was specially trained to work in extreme climatic conditions. On December 6, 1941, when the first rays of the winter sun illuminated the snow-covered fields of the Moscow region, Soviet artillery salvos thundered across the entire front. The counteroffensive near Moscow began, an operation that became the first major defeat of the German army in World War II. At the forefront of the advance were the very Siberian divisions that the Germans knew nothing about a month ago, but now they had become a symbol of the revival of the Red Army's fighting power. Preparations for the counteroffensive were carried out in strict secrecy. General Georgy Zhukov, appointed commander of the Western Front, carefully planned the operation, hoping to make the most of the surprise attack and the Soviet troops' superiority in winter conditions. Siberian divisions formed a strike group that was assigned a decisive role in breaking through the German defenses. The location of the Siberian troops before the start of the offensive was carefully planned. The most experienced divisions were concentrated in the main directions of the attack, near Kalinin, Klin, and Istra. Here, the German positions were most vulnerable, and the terrain was favorable for ski units. The reserve consisted of tank brigades equipped with the latest T-34 and KV tanks. The first hours of the offensive demonstrated the high combat qualities of the Siberian troops. Despite stubborn German resistance, the Far Eastern divisions methodically broke through the enemy's defenses, using their skills in winter combat. Ski battalions penetrated the rear of the German positions, destroyed headquarters and warehouses, and disrupted communications between units. The Siberian troops were particularly successful near Kalinin. Here, General Dmitry Lelyushenko's 30th Army, a significant part of which consisted of Far Eastern divisions, dealt a powerful blow to the stretched communications of the German 3rd Tank Group. During the first 2 days of fighting, Soviet troops advanced 15 to 20 kilometers and liberated several settlements. Units of General Konstantin Rokossovsky's 16th Army, also reinforced by Siberian divisions, advanced near Klin and Solnechnogorsk. The fighting here was particularly fierce, as the Germans understood the strategic importance of these directions. The Siberians showed exceptional courage and fortitude, repelling enemy counterattacks and steadily advancing forward. The tank units of the Siberian divisions also showed high efficiency. Their T-34 tanks, equipped with diesel engines that worked perfectly in the cold, destroyed German positions, preventing the enemy from gaining a foothold on the intermediate lines. German anti-tank guns were often unable to penetrate the armor of Soviet tanks, and their own tanks were massively disabled due to technical malfunctions. Artillery regiments of the Far Eastern troops provided the advancing infantry with powerful fire support. Their guns, adapted to work in extreme conditions, methodically destroyed German fortifications, suppressed firing points, and created firewalls in front of the attacking units. The accuracy of the Siberian artillerymen's fire was exceptionally high. The moral impact of the Siberian division's successes on the entire course of the counteroffensive cannot be overestimated. Their steadfastness and courage inspired the fighters of other units, showing that the Germans could not only be stopped, but also defeated. The fame of the Siberian bogatirs quickly spread throughout the front, becoming a symbol of the revival of the Red Army's fighting spirit. By mid-December 1941, it was clear that the counteroffensive near Moscow had been a complete success. Confusion reigned in the headquarters of the German armies besieging Moscow. Experienced German generals, accustomed to a continuous series of victories, were confronted for the first time with a situation that did not fit into their conception of the course of the Eastern Campaign. The unexpected arrival of fresh Soviet divisions not only halted the Wehrmacht's advance, but also launched a decisive counteroffensive, pushing the battle-hardened German units back dozens of kilometers from the Soviet capital. The first reports of the appearance of new Soviet troops reached the German command at the end of November 1941. Frontline scouts reported seeing soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, speaking with a distinctive accent, and well adapted to winter conditions. However, this information was not taken seriously at first by the headquarters of Army Group Center. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, who commanded Army Group Center, believed that the Russians had simply re-equipped the remnants of their defeated divisions with new uniforms to boost the morale of their troops. His chief of intelligence claimed that the Soviets had no reserves left that could seriously affect the situation near Moscow. This fatal miscalculation cost the German troops dearly when the Soviet counteroffensive began on December 6th. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, was one of the first to realize the seriousness of the situation. In his memoirs, He wrote that the appearance of the Siberian divisions came as a complete surprise to him. These troops were radically different from the Red Army units the Wehrmacht had fought in the first months of the war. They were well-trained, disciplined, and excellently equipped for winter combat. The German officers were particularly struck by the tactical competence of the Siberian commanders. Unlike many Soviet generals who threw their troops into frontal attacks, the Far Eastern commanders acted thoughtfully and cautiously. They skillfully used the terrain, weather conditions, and their superior winter equipment. Their strikes were precise and effective. German intelligence frantically tried to determine where the new Soviet divisions had come from. Interrogations of prisoners revealed that many of them had arrived from the Far East, but the scale of the transfer remained unknown. The headquarters of Army Group Center came up with various theories, ranging from the transfer of individual regiments to the mass redeployment of entire armies. Gradually, the German command realized that the Soviet Union had managed to secretly transfer significant forces from its eastern borders. This meant that calculations based on the rapid depletion of Soviet reserves were incorrect. The USSR had far greater resources than Berlin had assumed. The war promised to drag on indefinitely. The combat skills of the Siberian troops made a lasting impression on the Germans. Wehrmacht soldiers, accustomed to easy victories over European armies, encountered an enemy equal in strength for the first time. The Siberians did not retreat under the onslaught of German tanks, did not surrender at the first opportunity, and fought to the last bullet. Their snipers inflicted heavy losses on German officers. The psychological impact of the appearance of the Siberian divisions on the morale of the German troops was enormous. Many German soldiers began to doubt the possibility of a quick victory in the East. Propaganda convinced them that the Slavs were an inferior race incapable of organized resistance. Reality proved the opposite. The Germans were particularly hurt by the Siberian superiority in winter conditions. While German soldiers suffered from frost and frostbite, their opponents felt at home in the snow. They made long ski raids, set up ambushes, and launched surprise attacks on German communications. The winter, which was supposed to be an ally of the Aryans, turned against them. The technical superiority of the Siberian troops did not go unnoticed either. Their T-34 tanks proved to be more advanced than the German Panzer III and IV tanks. In the post-war years, many legends and myths arose about the role of the Siberian divisions in the Battle of Moscow. Some authors exaggerated their numbers, speaking of 100 divisions transferred from the Far East. Others, on the contrary, downplayed their significance, claiming that there were only a few regiments. As always, the truth lay somewhere in between, but it was only possible to establish it after the declassification of archival documents. According to official data from the General Staff of the Red Army, between October and December 1941, about 40 divisions and brigades with a total strength of over 400,000 men were transferred from the Far East and Siberia to the West. This constituted approximately 18% of all forces participating in the defense of Moscow and the winter counteroffensive. The largest units arriving from the east were divisions from the Transbaikal, Far Eastern, and Siberian military districts. Among them, the 78th Rifle Division of General Afanasy Beloborodov, which fought heroically near Istra, and the 32nd Rifle Division of Colonel Viktor Polosukin, which defended the approaches to Moscow near the village of Kryukovo, distinguished themselves. The weapons of the transferred divisions were indeed more modern than those of most Red Army units. The Far Eastern troops received the latest equipment as a matter of priority, given the tense situation on the border with Japan. Many tank brigades were equipped with T-34s and heavy KV tanks, and artillery regiments had new guns and howitzers. However, the state of the Siberian divisions should not be idealized. Many of them suffered significant losses during the transfer stage due to unsatisfactory transport conditions. Disease, frostbite, and accidents reduced their numbers by 10 to 15%, even before they entered combat. Some units arrived at the front incomplete. The combat experience of the Far Eastern troops was also mixed. Indeed, many officers and sergeants had been through conflicts with the Japanese at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol. However, a significant portion of the rank and file had been drafted after these events and had no real combat experience. Nevertheless, the overall level of training remained high. The Siberian soldiers' adaptation to the climate did give them a huge advantage. But this factor is often exaggerated in memoirs. Not all servicemen in the Far Eastern districts were native Siberians. A significant proportion were natives of the European part of the USSR who had been called up for service in eastern garrisons. Their resistance to the cold was not much higher than that of other Red Army soldiers. The role of Richard Sorge, a spy in the decision to transfer troops, also needs to be clarified. His reports on Japanese plans were important, but not the only factor. Stalin had other sources of information, including diplomatic channels and radio intercepts. The decision to transfer troops was made gradually and was based on a comprehensive assessment of the situation. By the end of 1941, the number of Japanese troops in Manchuria did not pose a serious threat to the USSR. The Kwantung Army was weakened by the transfer of some of its forces to the Pacific Theater of Operations. Nevertheless, significant Soviet forces remained on the Far Eastern borders, about 30 divisions ready to repel a possible attack. The German command paid dearly for underestimating the Siberian divisions. What was planned as a quick victory campaign turned into a protracted war of attrition that the Third Reich could not win. The appearance of fresh, well-trained Soviet troops near Moscow marked the beginning of the end for the German military machine on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's direct losses from the actions of the Siberian divisions in December 1941 and January 1942 amounted to over 100,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Army Group Center lost a significant part of its striking power, and many tank and motorized divisions were destroyed or suffered critical losses. The elite units of the Wehrmacht suffered particularly heavy losses. The tank divisions, which formed the backbone of German military power, lost most of their equipment. Many vehicles were damaged in battle, while others were rendered inoperable due to technical malfunctions caused by severe frost. By the spring of 1942, the combat effectiveness of the German armored forces had declined several times over. The moral losses were no less severe than the material ones. The myth of the invincibility of the German army was dispelled. Wehrmacht soldiers, accustomed to easy victories in Europe, tasted defeat for the first time. Many began to doubt the accuracy of Nazi propaganda about the racial superiority of Aryans over Slavs. The strategic consequences of the defeat near Moscow were even more serious. Plans for a lightning war collapsed completely. Germany had to prepare for a long struggle for which its economy and human resources were not equipped. The war took on the character of a competition in mobilization capabilities, where the advantage lay with the USSR. The failure of Operation Barbarossa forced Hitler to rethink his entire strategy. Whereas he had previously planned to quickly defeat the Soviet Union and then concentrate all his forces against England, Germany now found itself embroiled in a war on two fronts. The Reich's resources had to be spread between the eastern and western fronts. The political consequences of the defeat near Moscow were also disastrous for Germany. Neutral countries became convinced that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. This strengthened the US's resolve to enter the war against Germany. Japan, seeing the difficulties of its ally, concentrated on the war against the Anglo-American bloc, never opening a second front against the USSR. The economic cost of the German command's mistakes was enormous. The protracted war required enormous resources. The Reich's industry had to work at full capacity to compensate for the loss of equipment and weapons. Human resources were also being depleted faster than had been anticipated in pre-war plans. Germany's loss of reputation in the eyes of its allies and satellites was no less painful. Romania, Hungary, and Finland had tied their fate to the Third Reich, counting on its quick victory over the USSR. The failures on the Eastern Front forced these countries to reconsider their position and start looking for ways out of the war. For Hitler himself, the defeat at Moscow was a personal disaster. He had grown accustomed to a continuous string of successes that strengthened his power and authority. The first serious defeat undermined his prestige not only in the eyes of the people, but also among his entourage. The first doubts about the Führer's infallibility began to emerge, which would later lead to conspiracies against him. Most importantly, the defeat at Moscow showed the whole world that the USSR was capable not only of defending itself, but also of going on the offensive. The Battle of Moscow became the turning point after which World War II took a completely different course. Until December 1941, it seemed that nothing could stop the German war machine. After the counteroffensive near Moscow, it became clear that the Third Reich had an enemy capable not only of resisting, but also of defeating it. The role of the Siberian divisions in this turning point was decisive. The success of the Soviet counteroffensive radically changed the balance of power on the world stage. While in the first months of the war, many politicians and military experts predicted the rapid collapse of the USSR, it was now clear that the Soviet Union would remain in the war until the end. This forced Germany's potential allies to reconsider their plans. The Moscow victory had a particularly important impact on the position of the United States. President Franklin Roosevelt and his entourage closely followed developments on the Eastern Front. The successful defense of Moscow convinced the American leadership that support for the USSR was justified and could bring strategic dividends in the fight against fascism. Lend-Lease deliveries, which began even before the Battle of Moscow, increased significantly after December 1941. American tanks, aircraft, and vehicles poured into the USSR in large numbers. This aid largely compensated for the losses suffered by the Red Army in the first months of the war and allowed the Soviet command to plan further offensive operations. Great Britain also revised its strategy after the victory in Moscow. Whereas previously, the British leadership had viewed the USSR as a temporary ally that could withdraw from the war at any moment, it now became clear that the Soviet Union was a reliable and powerful partner in the fight against Nazi Germany. Within Germany itself, the defeat at Moscow raised serious doubts about the possibility of victory. German propaganda tried to portray the retreat from the Soviet capital as a tactical maneuver, but the population of the Reich understood the true scale of the disaster. The moral and psychological state of German society began to deteriorate. The failures in the East were particularly painful for the German army. The officer corps of the Wehrmacht, trained in the traditions of the Prussian military school, was accustomed to precise planning and flawless execution of operations. The failure at Moscow showed that the enemy was stronger than expected and that their own capabilities were more limited. Germany's allies were also not indifferent to the defeat of their main partner. In Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, a reassessment of the prospects for the war began. The governments of these countries began to look for opportunities for secret negotiations with the Western allies, preparing for a possible withdrawal from the war on Germany's side. Japan, which could have radically changed the situation by opening a second front against the USSR, finally opted for war in the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, took place the day after the start of the Soviet counteroffensive. This was no coincidence. The Japanese leadership saw Germany's difficulties and did not want to tie itself to a war against the strengthened USSR. The strategic initiative gradually shifted to the anti-Hitler coalition. Whereas previously, the Allies had been forced to react to Germany's actions, they now had the opportunity to plan their own offensive operations. The victory near Moscow was the first step towards a radical turning point in World War II. For the Siberian divisions themselves, the battle for Moscow was their moment of glory. Their courage and military skill were recognized not only in the USSR, but also among the Allies. Western military experts were forced to revise their views on the combat capabilities of the Red Army. 8 decades after that frosty winter, when the Siberian divisions saved Moscow, we can take stock and learn lessons from those dramatic events. The story of Hitler's underestimation of the Soviet Union's Far Eastern forces has become a classic example of how incomplete intelligence, ideological prejudices, and strategic overconfidence can lead to catastrophic consequences. The main lesson is that underestimating the enemy in military affairs is unacceptable. The German command, intoxicated by its successes in Europe, did not bother to thoroughly study the true capabilities of the Soviet Union. Racist ideology prevented an objective assessment of the potential of the Slavic peoples, their capacity for organized resistance and military buildup. The importance of high-quality intelligence cannot be overestimated. The Abwehr, considered one of the best intelligence services in the world, demonstrated blatant incompetence in assessing Soviet military potential. The vast expanses of Siberia and the Far East remained blank spots on the maps of German staff officers. This information blindness cost the Wehrmacht dearly. Geography as a factor in military strategy was also vividly confirmed by the events of 1941. The vastness of the Soviet territory, which the Germans considered a weakness of the USSR, turned out to be its strength. Deep defenses allowed time to be gained, and a developed railway network ensured the rapid transfer of troops to threatened areas. The role of the human factor in modern warfare became abundantly clear. No technical superiority can compensate for shortcomings in morale, training, and motivation. Siberian soldiers, hardened by harsh living conditions and raised in the spirit of defending their homeland, proved stronger than the technically superior but demoralized German troops. The climatic factor, which is often underestimated in the planning of military operations, played a decisive role in the battle for Moscow. The Russian winter became an ally of the defenders, as it had done many times before in Russian history. Adaptation to the harsh conditions gave the Siberian troops a huge advantage over the enemy. The importance of timely and accurate decisions by the top military and political leadership cannot be overstated. Despite all his shortcomings as a commander, Stalin managed to make the right decision to transfer troops from the Far East at a critical moment. This risk paid off and saved not only Moscow, but the entire country. The lesson for today is that a globalized world requires a comprehensive approach to security issues. It is impossible to focus all efforts in one direction, forgetting about other threats. The balance of power, diplomacy, and intelligence must work closely together to ensure national security. The history of the Siberian divisions also shows the importance of preserving and developing defense traditions. Military skills passed down from generation to generation played a critical role at a turning point in the war. Modern armies must not forget the importance of basic training for soldiers alongside the mastery of the latest technologies. Hitler's underestimation of the Siberian divisions was one of the fatal mistakes that led to the defeat of the Third Reich. This story reminds us that in military affairs, there are no small details, that every factor can be decisive, and that victory goes not only to the strongest, but also to the most prepared, motivated, and intelligent opponent. The memory of these events should serve as a warning to all who consider themselves invincible, and as an inspiration to those who defend their land and freedom.